Welcome to the latest Work Foundation event looking at the changing state of the UK labour market, where today we're going to be looking at the implications of the latest data out from the ONS this morning and looking ahead to 2025 to consider what we can expect to see happen in the world of work, jobs and the economy. My name's Ben Howson and I'm director here at the Work Foundation, a policy think tank which is part of Lancaster University. And we're really committed through the research and engagement work that we do to supporting everyone to access well-paid and secure employment. Our current work programme is particularly focused on job insecurity for those who face structural disadvantage within the labour market and the interrelationship between health and work. And we have in fact just published new research looking at the ways in which policy and employers can better support those with ill health to remain in the labour market. You can find that report and the findings on the Work Foundation website, and these are clearly going to be issues that we're going to be discussing and exploring today. Now, of course, the state of the UK labour market has dominated political discourse from the pandemic period through the cost of living crisis, the general election, and now the early months of the new Labour government. Addressing long-term challenges around pay, job security, ill health and economic inactivity have become central tenets of Labour's legislative agenda for the coming Parliament. And with a new employment rights bill, the Get Britain Working White Paper, industrial strategies and a renewed devolution drive, all in some way or another focusing on strengthening the labour market. But as we head to 2025, with so much policy change on the horizon, what can we hope to expect in terms of positive change in the jobs market? And what do we see as some of the biggest challenges? To help us discuss those questions, I'm delighted that we're going to be hearing from a fantastic panel of contributors today, including David Smith, the economics editor at The Times, Claire Reindorp, Chief Executive at the Young Women's Trust, and Alex Hall-Chen, Principal Policy Advisor at the Institute of Directors. Before we hear their initial reflections on the data this morning and the way they see the UK labour market, I want to set up the scene from the latest data this morning. So if we can pull the slides up, please. So this morning we saw that the employment rate is at 74.9%. That's up on the quarter, but largely unchanged on a year ago, while unemployment is also up on the quarter and on a year ago at 4.3%. Now, it's worth just restating the kind of health warning that the ONS themselves put around these figures due to lower sampling rates, but essentially it shows a relatively stable picture versus what the ONS has been presenting previously. Where we have seen some significant change is on vacancies. They've decreased to 818,000. So that means there are now 137,000 fewer vacancies than a year ago, and they have been falling consistently for 2.5 years. They're just about around the level that they were pre-pandemic. So they're still relatively high compared to some historical comparisons, but certainly lower than they have been in the post-pandemic period. Economic inactivity due to long-term sickness is also up on the year, up to around 2.8 million. It's been above 2.7 million for 17 consecutive months over recent times. And that's clearly a really significant issue we've heard from government around its Get Britain Working agenda as a response to that. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Regular pay growth has risen to 5.2% on the year, and that seems to be being driven by the private sector. The UK is in a run of around 33 months of above 4% pay growth. And that may seem and give a signal that actually things are very strong on the wages side of things. However, in reality, we must remember that on average, real-term wages are just £23 a week higher than they were at the start of the global financial crisis in August 2008. And that really reflects the fact that we've been through a 10 to 15-year period of wage stagnation. Next slide, please. And while unemployment is historically low, youth unemployment is up on the year at 12.7%. And separate data from the ONS in November 2024 showed that around 946,000 young people were not in education, employment or training. And that represents around 15% of young men and around 11% of young women. So clearly a significant set of challenges there as well. If we can take the slides down now, please, because I'd like to get going with the conversation. I'm going to invite David Smith to offer his perspectives on the latest data and the general labour market and economic picture first. And as we hear from our contributors, please do be thinking about the questions that you'd like to ask as we get into the open part of the conversation. If you do so through the questions function, that will be great, and I'll bring you in once we open out into the wider discussion. But for now, I'll hand over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Ben. It's a pleasure to be joining you this afternoon for this discussion. I'm always fascinated by the labour market statistics, and today's are no exception. So you've highlighted all the interesting things, and of course, the main headline that will be in the papers tomorrow about this is the strength of average earnings growth, 5.2% on both regular and total pay, and that, I think the implication of that is still a bit too strong for comfort for the Bank of England. But you also mentioned, Ben, the continued fall in the number of vacancies in the economy. So we're now just above 800,000. And we've moved away from what was an exceptionally unusual and tight position a couple of years ago, when the number of vacancies peaked at 1.3 million in 2022. And for a large part of that year, as you will remember, there was the ratio of unemployed people to vacancies was 1-to-1, which I don't think has ever happened before. It's now about 1.8, so that is, as you say, back to the pre-pandemic position, both in terms of the number of vacancies and in the ratio of unemployed people to vacancies. If you add on the number of economically inactive people who say that they are looking for work, that's gone up from 1.7 million a year ago to 1.9 million now. So, you know, this just speaks to the challenge of getting people who are economically inactive who want to work into jobs, and also to get into the unemployed into work. There is clearly quite a lot of mismatch in the labour market at the moment, that the kind of people that employers are looking for are not necessarily immediately available in the labour market. I think this is still quite a tight labour market. I think the average earnings figures tell us that. We haven't yet seen a reaction in the numbers to the budget, which as Alex will tell us, you know, many businesses were quite critical of because of the NI increase. That may come later. There was a fall in payroll jobs in November after the budget, but those figures are often prone to revision. There was a fall was recorded in the October data, and then today has been revised away to a decent increase. So I think we've still got a tight labour market. I think there are still many challenges there, and I think it's you know, the data uncertainty obviously makes things difficult, but there's still a long way to go before I would say we've got a normal, healthy, well-functioning labour market. A lot of work to do on that, which of course you at the foundation are engaged in. I'll stop there and pass on, I think, to Claire next.
Thank you, David. Shall I jump in, Ben?
Go for it, Claire.
Nothing like being eager. So I'm Claire of the Young Women's Trust, and our focus is on how young women aged 18 to 30 are faring in the workforce, particularly those in low pay. So as you'd expect, this afternoon I'm going to share evidence from their perspective and drawing on things of relevance to other marginalised groups in the labour market. And I'm just going to make two quick points. The first is about pay and poverty. I mean, David, I know, has emphasised the uptick in wage growth, it's 5.2%, but we know that there's been long-term wage stagnation of almost 2 decades now, and combined with high levels of economic insecurity due to things like ill health or caring responsibilities, we're seeing rising levels of poverty and financial stress. And in Young Women's Trust survey that we did in August this year, 41% of young women said their financial situation had got worse over the past 12 months compared to 27% of young men. A third of young women are taking on more debt compared to just over a quarter of young men. And 55% of young women told us that they felt a sense of dread when they thought about their financial circumstances. It's just a bit of a flavour that sits underneath these figures, really, about the realities in the labour market right now. The second point, which is a story underneath these figures, is about how that low pay is going hand in hand with increasing amounts of insecurity, something that I know that Ben's done a lot of work on with the Work Foundation. And more than a third of young women we spoke to are concerned about job security, and about the same proportion were worried about not having enough hours and underemployment. So some really big trends for young women and for other groups like them who are marginalised in the labour market. But we know that moving forward, as Ben has said, we've got some really exciting government announcements in terms of employment rights bills, which I think on things like the minimum wage and improved workers' rights is going to make a huge difference to some of the workers in the labour market that are most kind of hanging on by their fingertips. And we know there are some concerns from employers about national increases in NI along with the minimum wage. But there's some really good findings out too about the majority of businesses really welcoming these changes and thinking that it is going to support the economy over the longer term. So I think some reasons to be cheerful as we go into 2025.
Brilliant. Thanks, Claire. Alex, over to you, and then we'll open up the conversation.
Thanks very much, Ben, and good afternoon, everyone. So I lead on employment policy at the Institute of Directors, so I'm hoping to bring the perspective of business leaders to today's discussion. So the data released today that's of particular interest and potential concern to us is the decline in payrolled employees and vacancies, which, although not as much of a drop as some were expecting, we fear still points towards a worrying trend of lower hiring intentions. So we know that businesses have been struggling with labour and skill shortages for years. The data suggests that the shortages are starting to become a bit less acute, but our concern is really that it's not really for the right reasons. And that is not because of the availability of labour and skills improving, but because business demand for them is decreasing. So our research at the IOD suggests that the triple whammy of raising employers' national insurance contributions, the Make Work Pay package, and another hike to the national minimum and living wages is dampening hiring intentions. So we send out a monthly survey which asks business leaders whether they expect headcount at their organisations to increase, decrease, or stay the same over the next year. Since we started collecting this data in 2016, apart from a 6-month period in 2020, we've always taken a net positive reading. That ended in October this year, when we recorded the first negative reading since October 2020, at -4, down from +6 the month before that, and down from +22 in June. Then last month, after the budget, it had dropped to -24. We know that there has been a gradual eroding of positive hiring intentions in recent months, resulting from various employment policy changes related to the Make Work Pay package. In September, we asked members what impact the Employment Rights Bill would have on their hiring intentions, and 57% said that they would be less likely to hire staff as a result. And I'd also just want to mention here that as well as having a negative impact on job creation, we've had really clear feedback from members that as a result of the bill, where they do hire, many will do so more conservatively. And this stems particularly from the high threat of tribunal, which will result from the expansion of day one unfair dismissal protections. At its core, essentially, if businesses aren't confident that they can easily correct hiring mistakes, they'll take fewer risks when they're hiring people. And we're concerned that this could have a really damaging impact on the employment prospects of people on the fringes of the labour market, exactly the people who the government needs to get into the workforce if it's to meet its 80% employment rate target. But beyond the Employment Rights Bill, the biggest drop in hiring intentions has come from the increase to employers' NICs in the budget, as others have mentioned, with many of our members telling us that they are pausing or cancelling new roles, moving planned roles overseas, or even in some cases making redundancies as a result of the hike. And as well as inhibiting job creation, our data suggests that the NICs increase will reduce wage increases. Last month, we polled members and we asked them where they'd said that their NI bills are increasing, what their response to that will be. The top response, cited by 43% of business leaders, was that they will reduce wage increases in response. So I think what the ONS data, as well as our own research, tells us is that government employment policies are having a negative impact on employer hiring intentions, and that unless policy changes, we can expect to see a fall in demand for labour in 2025. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alex. And if I can ask all our panelists to turn their cameras back on, and we'll open up the conversation. Some really good prompts for discussion, I think, there from across the piece. Where I'd quite like to start is thinking about the sort of the overarching direction that the government in its sort of early months has set. And I think it's been pretty clear around some sort of ambitions that it's looking to really sort of establish throughout the course of this parliament. And a big one of those has been around economic growth and around making work pay. And I just wondered whether, given the context that each of you have sort of described today, where you feel the government is perhaps, on the right track in that regard, or where, and I think, Alex, you've just been describing some of these, where there may be some tensions that exist within some of the sort of these kind of competing priorities that are being articulated. David, I'll maybe come to you first, and then bring others in.
Yeah, I mean, there are tensions undoubtedly, and I think the interesting question. Maybe I could ask Alex to respond to a bit later on in the discussion, is whether there's any sense that reducing the incentives to employ is going to have, are firms more likely to invest? Is there a productivity effect here from labour becoming more expensive and so on? So that's interesting. But I think it is, at the moment, growth is pretty weak. And although predictions have been revised up by the OBR and the Bank of England for next year in terms of economic growth, that is largely a public sector effect, public spending effect, which we can talk about a bit later. And I think the particular thing that I didn't, I couldn't quite reconcile with the national insurance package was the decision to bring down the threshold so much, which particularly affects sectors which employ relatively low-paid workers and part-timers, retail, hospitality, those sectors. Now, whether that is to, there is some Machiavellian aim there to squeeze out low pay by making low-paid workers more expensive to employ, and then you have to move up the skills ladder, and you have to move up the occupational ladder. But I think it's quite a big ask to do that certainly in a relatively short time. So I don't see how this all gels at the moment, I must say. And at the moment, you would be quite, as Alex said, be relatively pessimistic about private sector employment prospects, I think.
And coming to you then, Alice, because it's a good opportunity to perhaps respond to the issue that David just raised there around potential productivity gains. And it's actually something which Sarah Hadfield in the Q&A tab has asked as well, in terms of, do you think employers will create better jobs if they're hiring fewer people into bad jobs? So the kind of net impact of some of these changes, are there any upsides to kind of counterbalance some of the kind of negatives that you were describing earlier?
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting question. And actually, a couple of months ago, we did poll members on what their response to increases to the national minimum and living wages would be. And one of the response options that we gave was essentially investing in automation, but also, investing in employee training to reap productivity benefits. And, I think for both instances, it was about 10 to 20% of members said that they would invest in those two areas. So there's undoubtedly a portion of businesses who, in direct response to labour becoming more expensive, will invest either in the technology that supports automation or in employee training, both of which have absolutely very significant positives. But we also got higher response rates when it came to options around making redundancies, reducing future sort of wage increases potentially in other parts of the business. So I suppose that's where our concern lies. So yeah, that there may be some positives, but we think it's outweighed by the overall sort of negative impacts that it's going to have.
Claire, you sort of were I guess more optimistic in your opening reflections on the kind of impact of the legislation. Are you sort of at all concerned that the sort of net impacts on the sort of fortunes for particularly young women from your perspective, but also other worker groups who tend to be in these more low paid, insecure roles as a result of the kind of combination of all the changes happening at the moment?
Well, I mean, I'm no economist in terms of working out what this might mean in the labour market, but I think, there's different voices that we haven't got here in the room, like the TUC's analysis that it could generate £13 billion for the UK economy once the workers' rights are strengthened in this way. And we can certainly see the huge costs to workers who are hanging on in the labour market, not being able to engage effectively, and the many people who can't get into employment. I saw Laura Jane in the chat raise both young men and young women who are NEET, and that the kinds of reforms that are coming down the track, things like flexible apprenticeships, rebooting the careers, job service, more flexible work, childcare entitlements. These are all things that are going to help people get into the labour market and stay there and have more talent in the labour market. And I see that as all upside. But there might be some frictional costs, I think, of moving to a new system. But this is something that other countries have done very well, strengthened workers' rights and grown their economies. So I think it's possible.
Yeah, and certainly Work Foundation analysis would support the fact that, you know, the high instances or concentrations of insecure work have been a real drag on the labour market overall, but also having really significant implications for the kinds of groups that you've been describing. But I'm sort of keen to also go back to the kind of, I think, Alex, you were the one who referenced it in your reflections, sort of Labour's 80% employment target, and the extent to which that feels realistic and achievable from where we are today through the course of this parliament. I've sort of found it quite telling that I've heard less about that in sort of government statements as to one of their sort of key success measures than perhaps during the election campaign or in the early days of the government. So Alex, I'll maybe come back to you to just sort of clarify whether you think that is something which will remain a kind of key focus of the government, or whether actually the focus may well shift in terms of quality of that employment, or making sure that, you know, work pays for those who are in employment.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, the first thing to say is that you think it's very much a great target to have, and it should continue to be, the foundation for much of what government's trying to do in this space. I think the decreasing prevalence of it being mentioned is probably due to the fact that it's going to be exceptionally difficult for government to achieve it, and that given the current focus of policy, we think it's unlikely, certainly given the feedback that we've had from members, that they're going to see the kind of expansion in job opportunities that will be needed to achieve that 80% rate. Obviously, there are also really difficult questions around how to move people currently to on the fringes of the labour market, particularly actually where, you know, the long-term sickness is involved. And to an extent, there's not a huge amount that some employers can do. There are obviously things around flexible working, things which can help, but a lot of this does come down to very sticky issues around the NHS. So I'd say it will still exist as a metric. I think they'll be a bit quieter about it, because if they are going to achieve it, it's going to take a long time.
Fantastic. David, I'll bring you in on that as well. And we've also had a couple of other questions which you may want to offer some reflections on. One from Colin Crooks, who's asking around the kind of regional differences in some of these sort of top line measures. And of course, we know that those are a significant factor, and then in part the devolution agenda as well as investment industrial strategy is sort of designed to sort of tackle some of those. And then we've also had a question around the sort of net impact of some of the things like childcare interventions that Claire has referenced, and whether they will ultimately have a kind of net positive impact on labour participation in the future.
Yeah, very good questions. I think governments like these targets. I think Gordon Brown set an 80% home ownership target when he was either Chancellor or Prime Minister. And I think if you put a straight line on what was happening in the 2010s in terms of employment growth and the rise in the employment rate, then you would think that 80% was achievable. Of course, there were lots of special factors there, including an increase in older women in the employed workforce because of changes in the pension age and so on. But I think the regional, it used to be that we would look at the regional labour markets, and the big differences were in unemployment rates. These days, as you know, they're in employment rates and in participation. And the regions which struggle are the ones which have relatively low employment rates, and that is a legacy of past industrial structure and all those things. And I think we sometimes think of the productivity problem as if only you could address all the weak parts of the economy and bring them up. I think it's a bit like that with getting the employment rate up. you get the employment rate up in those parts of the country which have very low employment rates at the moment, then I think you'd be a long way on the road to getting 80%. You know, it's a tough target, I think, which is why, as you said, it's not being spoken about so much now. But I think it's not an embarrassing target to have. I think it's reasonable to have. By the way, just on Claire's point, I think the package of employment rights was actually very well judged. You know, I think it was a good compromise between perhaps everything that TUC might have wanted and everything that employers would have objected to. I think the government went quite well down the middle of those two things. So I don't have any particular problem with that. Alex might, but I don't have any particular problem with the package of employment rights. But can we get to 80%? You know, this is not the 2010s. You know, we're not going to get 4 million more people in work during this decade, particularly from the point we've started at, where, you know, on the ONS labour force survey figures, we've barely got more people in work than at the end of 2019. So we're almost halfway through the decade, and we haven't really started yet. But it's a decent target. You know, no point in not being ambitious, I think.
Thanks, David. And just picking up on the employment rights points you were making there and drawing on some of Claire's reflections, just to quickly come back to you, Alex, on what you were mentioning around the kind of cooling impact that may have had, some of the uncertainties around tribunals, etc., and the kind of testing of new regulations. Do you anticipate that as we get through 2025, and I suppose more is understood and known about the specifics on some of those new regulations, that there will be opportunities to perhaps reassure employers?
Yes, yeah, I think that's definitely potentially the case. I think there's a huge amount in the Make Work Pay package that still lacks a lot of detail, as is to be expected given the stage that we're at. But there are certain areas where I think more detail could quieten employers' fears. I think the biggest example of that is around probation periods. We've had really strong feedback from members that they are incredibly worried, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, about the impact that that Day 1 protection against unfair dismissal will have on their ability to part ways with hiring mistakes, essentially. Now, government has, of course, said there will be a statutory probation period. 6 or 9 months seems most likely, with a light touch dismissal process. Where we hear concern from members is they say, well, look, if there is still that threat of tribunal from day one related to parting ways with someone because they weren't the right fit for the job, that reluctance to hire or to take risks during hiring will still exist. But if it is really a genuinely very light touch process that's very easy for an employer, particularly an SME, to navigate, then I think it could reduce the impact on hiring. And that's true of various other areas in the Employment Rights Bill. But I think the point that I just want to make as well is that what we've been the message we've been trying to give to government is you need to look at the cumulative impact. You know, in the Employment Rights Bill alone, there are 28 different measures. The Make Work Pay package is taking probably a similar number of measures through non-legislative routes. Combine that with the increase to national insurance contributions, it is a huge amount for any business to deal with, but particularly an SME. You know, imagine you have no HR function, you hire 10 people, and you have to deal with all of this coming at once. People like to draw comparisons with the introduction of the minimum wage, but that was done pretty much very slowly, introduced at a low rate. So businesses had time to adjust, essentially the point I'm trying to make. So that's really where a lot of our concern comes from, that it's being introduced really quite quickly and a huge amount at the same time.
So I suppose that does underscore the importance really of consultation and discussions that will take place through the course of next year, because you're right, these sort of bills are being introduced simultaneously, but I suppose on the upside, we do now have a sort of runway essentially with some important milestones around it, where there's an opportunity at least to try and diffuse some of that or provide some of that information for businesses. I'm conscious that throughout your reflections as well, we've sort of talked about some of those sectors which are perhaps under most pressure at the moment. And Claire, I was going to bring you in on this because I know you've done lots of work around the sort of employment of young women in those sectors where potentially insecure work is more concentrated, or low quality work is more concentrated. And of course, some of these interventions we're talking about are designed to try and strengthen that. But I just wondered what your reflections are as we get to the end of 2024 and into 2025 on how young women are faring in those sorts of sectors and their sort of concerns for the year ahead?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as you say, we've done some research in this in August, September time, looking at what is happening in things like retail, care, and hospitality sectors where young women are more likely to be there in low pay. And picking up Laura Jane's point, young men are, but that young women are then not progressing out of them. And they're not just facing low pay and insecurity, they're also facing poor and in some cases illegal employment practices and a tsunami of discrimination. And just take hospitality, 41% of young women were asked to work without a contract. 29% have been paid less than the minimum wage that they were entitled to, which I think is a pretty shocking stat. It's 29%. And less surprisingly, 0 hours contracts were the norm at around sort of 61%. So we know that the provisions in the Employment Rights Bill to tackle insecurity are really critical. But the other thing we haven't talked about at all is the importance of good enforcement. And we've got some sectors where we've got rogue employers, where I'd call it like the Wild West of HR. And in the Employment Rights Bill, we obviously have the Fair Work Agency, but there's going to be a real need for that enforcement system to be accessible to marginalised workers, to be properly funded, and for enforcement to be really proactive, because we see widespread law breaking. We found 20% of young women were saying they hadn't been paid the minimum wage they were entitled to. I mean, the list goes on. So there's what we want employers to do and what some employers are actually doing, and the enforcement has been very weak.
That's actually a really helpful segue, Claire, because I did want to kind of come back to that point around government spending to support some of these interventions. And Alex, you'd earlier mentioned around the kind of state of the NHS and the extent to which that was bearing down on some of the health issues that we're seeing. And you're absolutely right, Claire, in what you say around the kind of investment in enforcement. So we are going to have a new body which is kind of bringing together government resources around enforcement, but exactly how well that's equipped in the forthcoming spending review, I think, is going to be absolutely critical. And David, you've sort of reflected on some of this earlier in your remarks too. I just wonder what your sort of reflections heading into 2025 are about the sort of shape of that spending review and the sorts of things that we might end up hearing from Rachel Reeves and Treasury colleagues in sort of future statements, because both she and the Prime Minister have reflected that they don't really want to have a repeat of this year's budget, but in terms of tax measures and things like that. But I just wonder whether that is a kind of guarantee they're going to be able to keep to, given the sort of the macro state of the economy.
Well, I think it's very difficult. I mean, I think the new government made a mistake of describing the economic inheritance as the worst ever, but certainly the fiscal inheritance, which is part of the economic inheritance, was pretty bad, despite Conservative attempts to deny it. And there was no room, certainly, for the employee national insurance cuts before the election that Jeremy Hunt announced. So I think the public finances were in a tricky state. I think the aim that Rachel Reeves has got, which is don't keep mentioning Gordon Brown, is a bit of an echo of the kind of Iron Chancellor. She said she'll run this spending review with an iron fist, and they've already sort of laid down a marker by suggesting that public sector pay should only rise by 2.8%, which I think they'll be lucky to stick to that. If you look at the public finances, there's a bit more room for manoeuvre because of a change in the debt target, but overall things are still pretty tight. And I think the difficulty the government is going to run into is that the ambitions of people who work in the public sector, people who support the public sector, people who want quite speedy resolution of some of the problems in the NHS and elsewhere, will run up against the kind of rather uncomfortable fiscal reality. And I don't think that means there's going to be another Alex, you can relax. I don't think there's going to be another massive increase in taxes on employers, but I think it's going to be some time before we can say that public finances are fixed, I think, and that means it's going to be tense. But if looking at the balance of the labour market into 2025, I think we're already getting a clue on that from today's figures. In fact, that if you look at public sector employment, It was up by another 26,000 in the third quarter. It's up on a adjusted for reclassifications. Public sector employment is up by almost 100,000 over the past year, and I think that is to a certain extent the shape of things to come. I think we're going to see the private sector being quite cautious about employment. The private sector is never as cautious as it suggests it might be. I don't think. I mean, the private sector is still a great driver of employment over the long term. But for the next year, I think the public sector is going to be in the driving seat, and we're going to see quite a lot of public sector employment. If you look at the NHS workforce plan, that's going to continue for a few years to come. And then you get into, and I don't know what Alex and Claire think of this, or what you think of this, Ben, but the OBR in its assessment of the budget thought that there could be quite a lot of crowding out in the labour market from public sector recruitment. I don't know whether we're seeing that or we will see that, but I think that is one of the interesting questions to ask about 2025.
Absolutely. Thanks, David. And so I'm conscious we've got around 20 minutes left of the conversation. I want to come back around to economic inactivity and just take a few questions around that. And Alex, to come to you based on David's point just there around kind of demand within the private sector. We've just had a couple of questions as well from those watching, which I want to pick up on. So there's been a specific thing here around, as the proposed legislation is in relation to unfair dismissal, this is the Employment Rights Bill, and not legitimate dismissal, quote unquote. Is it not the case that good employers have little to fear? And I just wondered whether, Alex, you might want to come back on that in particular.
Yeah, and I totally understand the question. The concern coming from employers isn't that they will no longer be able to unfairly dismiss someone. It is the threat of tribunal that arises from that would be able to arise from anyone who is dismissed for performance-related issues in the first few months. We get a lot of feedback from members saying we take risks in hiring. Most of the time it works. Sometimes it doesn't. They need to be able to easily part ways with the people who basically aren't suited for doing the job. Now, if there is that threat of being taken to tribunal for unfair dismissal, whether or not it actually was truly unfair dismissal from day one, that's where that risk really comes in from employers. And we also need to remember that the tribunal system at present is massively overwhelmed. Already at the moment, we're hearing of cases taking 2 to 3 years to actually get to tribunal. That's a huge amount of uncertainty for both the employer and the employee. And we haven't yet heard a convincing sort of case from government about how they're actually planning to better resource the system so that the likely increase in cases that will arise from the Employment Rights Bill won't worsen that situation. So it's kind of taking those things together, which creates the worry for employers.
Just on that, Alex, and so I think one of our concerns about that system being overwhelmed is it obviously acts as a deterrent for those who have been on the receiving end of unfair treatment pursuing it because of the sort of nature of that process as it is. But would you welcome, in your sort of employees that you talk to, welcome more clarity that appears to be being proposed around things like probationary periods, where perhaps previously there has been less clarity than is what is being offered at the moment? Would that sort of help resolve some of those concerns?
I think some of them it is a really interesting point that at the moment there is really no legal concept, as I understand it, of a probationary period. So this is actually a very new sort of approach to have a statutory probation period. And as we kind of discussed earlier, if it is genuinely a really easy process to dismiss someone because it just the hiring decision wasn't right, and the threat of tribunal is proved to be really low from that, then I think it could go a good way to mitigating that concern.
Yeah. So I want to move on now to the sort of the issue around economic inactivity and health in particular, because clearly this is one of the sort of headline issues dominating labour market discourse in the UK over many months now, and the government has issued a sort of statement of intent in a sense around the areas which it's seeking to reform over the coming period. And there's a question from Richard Heron around the sort of absence of occupational health investment, which I think is very interesting. Certainly it's something the Work Foundation's been looking at, which we might get to. But Claire, I just want to come to you in the first instance around, because we've had those numbers around the number of young women and young men who are currently out of the labour market or educational training. And just to get your sense of the things which you feel could really make a difference to try and bring some of those numbers down for young people in particular.
Yeah, well, our focus is predominantly young women in the workplace rather than outside it. But I think broadly, we welcome the ambition and the great Get Working white paper. I think, as I said before, there's things in there about rebooting the careers and job service and making that much more bespoke. We know that getting young people into any job leads to them going into poor work and often not progressing out of it. We've in the past have called for young women to have access to flexible apprenticeships. That's in there. And so I think there is some really positive, ambition on the table. I think that the level of funding for it and that ambition to try and work more locally and get health and skills joined up in local places and seeing what those trail finder areas do is going to be really important, because some of this is really intricate work, and the needs of those young people, the mental health conditions that they're experiencing. We know that there's lots of reasons why they're not in the workforce, and it's intricate, bespoke, tailored support that is needed. So I think the ambition is there, and now it's really about how that gets implemented on the ground. I'd be interested to hear whether you've done any work in the Work Foundation on that kind of what works best for needs in relation to the white paper.
Yeah, so our most recent research, and it's very much in the spirit of Richard's question actually around occupational health, and maybe to come to you next, Alex, on this, was really looking at the fact that the data is pretty clear that once you've dropped out of the labour market and the first sort of year or two passes, it is increasingly hard to support people back in. And so actually we feel one of the kind of missing bits of the picture on the white paper, not entirely missing because they've announced a review around it, but where we need more focus in the future is how do we retain people in the labour market when they do fall ill, and how can we keep them in work? And I think you mentioned in your opening remarks, Alex, around the kind of role of employers there, flexible working, that certainly came through strongly in the research that we've undertaken. But so really did the role of occupational health and the extent to which what's currently on offer within those employers who do have an occupational health provision is fit for purpose, and how we might expand coverage for employers who don't currently offer it. And I just wondered, Alex, from your perspective, what your reflections were on the role of employers generally, but specifically around that kind of provision of occupational health to try and address some of this.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we know that UK employer spending on occupational health is relatively low compared to other countries. And we actually did a bit of research around this. It must have been about a year and a half ago, when the previous government consulted on potential measures to increase employer investment in occupational health. We found that, perhaps unsurprisingly, the smaller a business is, the less likely they were to be investing in occupational health. Where members told us they weren't investing, we then essentially said that the government is suggesting these various measures, ranging from a new standard on occupational health provision through to changes to the benefits in kind system. And probably again, unsurprisingly, the most popular measure was change to the benefit in kind system. That was, according to our research, the most likely to get our members to spend more money on occupational health provision, essentially. So that's what we recommended to government, and we hope that, under the review that the current government takes, that they will take on board the evidence that was sort of gathered as part of that previous exercise, because it's clearly a really important part of the picture, that we just highlight that there are huge cost pressures, particularly on SMEs at the moment. We know from the impact assessment for the Employment Rights Bill that costs are going to disproportionately fall on SMEs. So that's continually a case that we're trying to make to government. But absolutely, occupational health needs to be part of it. But I think there's also a potentially somewhat unanswered question here about what is the role of an employer relative to the National Health Service when it comes to various aspects of health provision. And that's certainly a theme that came out in our research.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly in terms of that theme of early intervention, the kind of access to NHS services is going to be key. And just to reinforce the point you made earlier with our own data, Alex, on flexibility, we found, a really significant difference where those who fall ill had access to flexible working policies or more autonomy in their jobs, being able to remain in work rather than falling out. David, I'll come to you now for your sort of general reflections on that participation point, but I guess in particular how it connects into supporting more people to remain in work in the first place.
Yeah, no, I think I saw your research on that, and I think it's very interesting. And as you say, the longer that people are out of the workforce, the more difficult it is to get back in, and a life of long-term sickness becomes the norm. And we've seen an 800,000 increase in the number of people who are economically inactive because of long-term sickness since before the since before the pandemic, and the vast majority of it has nothing to do with COVID, as you know. It's difficult. I think for a long time flexibility, remote working, that was seen as a great benefit, and which should enable people, if they're in the right kind of jobs, to keep working even if they're in ill health. But remote working may have contributed to some of the mental health problems that younger people have got in the workforce. They needed the contact, they needed the mentoring and all those things. So I think it's a really tricky problem, and it was quite striking that the OBR, when they looked at ambitions to reduce NHS waiting lists, they found that would probably have a very small effect on economic inactivity as a result of long-term sickness. So I think often people just blame the fact that there is a massive waiting list, but it doesn't. You can't put two and two together and make five in this context. I think it is really tricky. It's a problem we didn't anticipate, I don't think, and now we've got it. It's a huge challenge to do. Occupational health is obviously very important, but this has to be quite multifaceted, I think, and really get into the problem. I mean, everybody's got an individual long-term sickness problem. You can't, and across the board policies, it's quite difficult to design them in a way that addresses those individual problems.
Yeah, well, and some of the long-term trends from organisations like the Health Foundation are quite alarming in terms of what we can expect over coming years and decades in terms of the overall levels in the population of sort of ill health. Claire, I know you wanted to come in on the role of line managers, which I think perhaps complements what David was just reflecting on there, on the nuances on flexible working.
Just a quick point about really important piece of the jigsaw that I think we should really have in the discussion today is that's really startling stat from the CMI that 82% of line managers are accidental line managers and have had no training or support to take on that role. And if you think about the changes that are coming up in the next year or two, that sophisticated line management, we've got 1.7 million workers with work limiting health conditions, like referrals to occupational health, making sure flexible jobs are designed, understanding the changes. It's going to be a really key thing. Particularly for younger people and how they start their careers, those first line managers are champions or gatekeepers, and for older workers, retaining them in the workforce. So we invest less in management than many of our competitors do internationally. I think that is something for us to really think about, and obviously supporting small businesses is part of that. It really makes a big difference to the experiences of young women in the workplace, and I think many other groups.
Absolutely. Alex, I'll let you come in to sort of reflect on that from Claire, because I know it will be an important issue for you and the employees you engage with. But also I wanted to ask you, Alex, whether there were things within the sort of context of what we've been talking about this morning that employers heading into 2025 are particularly going to be looking for from government. So perhaps less around their sort of responses immediately to the kind of legislation that is in train today, but other things that they're perhaps either looking for support from government on or guidance and direction to sort of help support them grow in the future.
Yeah, so I mean, just on the point on line managers, completely agree as with Claire's point that the UK historically underinvests in line management training. And I know that one of the concerns raised by the effective defunding under the levy of level 7 apprenticeships is the impact that will have on the prevalence, or the already low prevalence of management training across the UK. So that absolutely needs to be on government's radar. In terms of what business is looking for from government, the point we've been making for a very long time is that business wants stability. It wants a long-term vision from government, and certainly prior to the election and to an extent post the election, the Labour government has been very keen to give that kind of message to business. And I think it's emerging work on the industrial strategy is probably the most important strand of work that it's doing in that space, just in terms of that long-term vision that it gives, and confidence, particularly in sectors that are likely to be benefited by it, that it gives business. So if there's one thing that doesn't involve reversing some of the policies of the previous few months, I'd say get the industrial strategy right and really engage with business and give it that long-term vision so that they can plan.
Picking up that mantle, David, are there things which the government should be considering as it rolls out those industrial strategies and sort of beefed up devolution deals to help support it? based on previous attempts to do this? Because obviously we've been through rounds of this, as ever, with governments introducing industrial strategies, regional development agencies, etc. Where can the government sort of avoid some of the bear traps from the past and actually sort of really deliver on this ambition in the future?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to regional policy, we've been here many times before, and levelling up was just another example of a failed regional policy. So I think devolution is promising. I think planning reform is promising. If you want to get businesses back on your side as a government, planning reform is a pretty good way of going about it, because it's not just the house builders. I think and for the house builders and for everybody else in the construction industry, it's having those pathways into work that used to exist but don't exist anymore, which is why everybody says that the housing target is unachievable, because there just aren't enough construction workers, not enough young people entering that industry. So I think it has to be many things. Business. I'm speaking for Alex here, but business wants to be loved. It wants to have a good relationship with this government. It started on a bad note. Industrial strategy, the sense that business and government is working together to try and give us some decent growth, I think is going to be very important for the government to try and foster over the next few months. It's not impossible that they do that, I think. And Rachel Reeves very much thinks that as she has said, that the budget was the bad news, and there is still good news to come from government for business in coming months and years. So, but I think it's very important that happens over the next few months.
And just Alex, to come back to you on this, I suppose I'm sort of constantly unsure between the sort of positions of there's a lot all happening at once here, and it all feels very intense and busy. But at the same time, some of the kind of time horizons on that, the industrial strategy and other measures actually paying dividends are probably going to be for the medium and the long term. And I just wondered how employers are feeling about that, but also whether you feel the government has that kind of time to sort of put the engines of the economy back onto a better footing, given, the next election, I can barely believe I'm saying this, given the last one was only 6 months ago, but it will come around probably quicker than perhaps some of these changes really have full effect.
Yeah, well, of course, that's the perennial issue with governments that are elected and re-elected every 5 years, and that it makes that long-term planning extremely difficult. Now, it's entirely true that a lot of the pain is going to be felt in the short term, and that any gains from industrial strategy are likely, as you say, to be medium to long term. But what business really values is that sense of, well, there is a long-term plan. I can start, building, whether it's like, skills planning, financial planning, everything. They can start making those plans beyond like a 1-year horizon. That's what business really values, stability. So even if they are not going to see financial returns from that industrial strategy within a 1-year time horizon, it will still give businesses the confidence, which at the moment is incredibly low.
And Claire, do you sort of see a role or perhaps a gap as it exists at the moment within some of these local growth strategies in particular, to be thinking about particular worker groups that are perhaps tend to be disadvantaged within the labour market? And I suppose from your perspective, young women in particular, would you want to see greater visibility for that sort of thing in the local economic planning that takes place over the next wee while?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the involvement of the mayors and that sense of like the intricacies of a local system and that co-design at a local regional level, I think is really important to actually trying to get that local agencies working together and get the perspective of workers themselves here. We're really keen to feed the views of young women in that they've got a particular sense about what will work and be accessible for them. And I think that kind of getting that right, there's a reason some of these things haven't worked in the past, isn't it? They're not easy problems to fix. So they are going to require that kind of careful trialing, piloting, iteration. And I think there is some rightly long time scales for bringing some of these things in and doing a bit of test and learn first.
Yeah. We've got about a few minutes left in the event, and so I want to begin wrapping up. And I thought one way we might do that, given we are at the end of 2024 and heading into 2025, would be to ask each of our panelists for their prediction heading into the new year with the labour market in mind. Now, we are recording the event, but I promise that we won't hold these predictions against you if they turn out to be way off the mark, so don't worry. But David, I might come to you first in terms of offering us a sense from your perspective of what could we expect to see happen in the labour market over the course of the next 12 months?
Yeah, what I would say, I don't think we should be too gloomy about the labour market, because despite a lot of fire and fury from businesses in response to the budget, I think we should remember, as I was saying earlier, that we've moved away from we've only just come out of the tightest labour market we've ever had, where the problem for many businesses was labour shortages, and still is. Skill shortages are still a problem, and so on. So I don't think you move from there to mass redundancies very quickly. I think we're more of a gentle transition to a more normal labour market. And as I say, I think the rising public sector employment will support the labour market as well. So I don't think we should be too gloomy. Wouldn't expect to see unemployment go up. I think it might go up a little bit, but not very much. We might go to 4.5% from 4.3%. But I don't think it's going to be a terrible year for the job market. It will stay relatively tight, I think, and employment may be a bit flat overall, but certainly not Armageddon in 2025.
So I might characterise that, David, as sort of lukewarm optimism for what we might.
Yeah, that's fair.
Cautious optimism, perhaps. Yeah, cautious optimism.
Cautious optimism. Yeah.
Alex, I'll come to you next.
So I wouldn't predict Armageddon. I definitely agree with David on that. I mean, I think we would take a probably slightly gloomier outlook, certainly for private sector employment. I don't think it's going to be a massive drop, but if the sort of feedback we've had from members is accurate, then we would expect to see a drop in vacancies, certainly. But so you take the point that the labour market is still historically fairly tight, although I think there's another issue that we would need a whole other webinar, is about skills mismatch, and the extent to which that needs to be tackled by government. So yes, a bit gloomier. We would expect to see that decline, but if government can get the notes right on industrial strategy, then that may sort of ameliorate the negative impact.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alex. Claire, the final word comes to you, and heavy responsibility to send us on our way with a sort of optimistic take, please.
I think that's why you came to me last, Ben. I think I've not got so much a prediction as a Christmas wish, which is, I hope that employers are beginning to actively prepare for the reforms that are coming their way, which I think will be good for business, great for individual workers, and I hope we're going to have some healthy, wealthier, happier employees in 2025 with more security and predictability in their lives for the benefit of everyone. So that's what I'd like for Christmas and to see through next year.
Fabulous. Well, you more than delivered on that brief. Thank you to all of our panelists. I think that brings our conversation to a close this afternoon. And thanks to all of you for attending, and the Work Foundation team who lead on producing our analysis and on putting sessions like this together. We've got a busy programme of research and events, as you'd expect, coming up in 2025 as well. We have just published 2 major studies into long-term insecurity in the labour market and how people can progress out of insecure work into more secure work. And as I mentioned earlier, around the retention of those who fall ill in the workforce. They're both available online. If you'd like to find out more about the latter analysis, you can sign up to our next event, which is focused on healthier jobs to tackle economic inactivity. That's taking place at 2 o'clock on the 9th of January 2025. And you can sign up via our website. For now, though, thank you once again. I hope you found the discussion valuable. And from everyone at the Work Foundation, we wish you an enjoyable festive break when it arrives.